You open your eyes to the dim glow of a flickering candle. The air is heavy, stale with damp stone and the faint metallic tang of rusted iron. Imagine yourself standing within the cold walls of a medieval jail, a place where the concept of justice was as fluid and unpredictable as the wind that seeped through the cracks of its walls. It is night, deep into the 14th century. Outside, the streets are silent save for the echo of boots and the occasional bark of a watchman's dog. The world you're about to enter is not one of knights and glory, but of darkness, desperation, and survival. For every tale of a chivalrous hero, there existed another, one that spoke of outlaws, murderers, and those who thrived in the cracks of medieval order. And as you listen now, slowly drifting into the steady rhythm of history, we will uncover the stories of the darkest criminals of the medieval world, the ones whose names echoed in whispers and whose crimes left stains on parchment and memory alike. In the medieval era, crime was not only a reflection of moral failure, it was often a reflection of circumstance. Hunger could turn a peasant into a thief, desperation could make a servant a murderer, and vengeance could drive even the noblest to savagery. The thin line between sin and survival blurred beneath the dim glow of candlelight and the ever-present eyes of the church. The justice system was primitive, often brutal, and deeply intertwined with religion. To commit a crime was not only to offend the law, but to offend God himself. The story begins in England, during the reign of King Edward III, when medieval society was at once thriving and decaying. The Black Death had swept across Europe, killing nearly half the population. The fields were empty, the villages half abandoned, and many who survived found themselves destitute. In this vacuum of order, new types of criminals emerged. Men and women who lived beyond the reach of law, who found power in the wilderness, in the forests, and in the chaos of a fractured kingdom. One of the most infamous of these early figures was Adam Bell, a name that still lingers in the border tales between England and Scotland. Though less known today than Robin Hood, Adam Bell was considered far darker, a man who lived by his bow, hunted deer not for sport but for survival, and robbed travelers who crossed the northern passes. Unlike the romanticized outlaws of later legend, Bell's story was laced with blood and retribution. He and his companions, Clym of the Clough and William of Cloudsley, were not heroes of the poor. They were survivors of a system that left no mercy for the hungry. When the forests became forbidden hunting grounds, enforced by royal decree, those who once depended on them for food were declared criminals. The forest law was absolute. To kill a deer could mean the loss of an eye, a hand, or a life. Yet Adam Bell and his men defied it. They hunted under moonlight, traded stolen game for bread, and became symbols of quiet rebellion. The king's men called them traitors. The peasants whispered of them as folk heroes. But in the quiet truth of history, their deeds were neither noble nor purely evil. They were born of necessity. The medieval criminal, you see, was not often driven by greed. He was driven by survival in a world that offered no pity to those at the bottom. If you walked through a medieval marketplace, you would see why such lives emerged. The stalls were filled with the scent of salted fish, coarse bread, and ale. Merchants haggled under the eye of the sheriff, and yet poverty lingered at every corner. A loaf of bread cost what a peasant might earn in several days. The punishments for theft were public and severe: the stocks, the pillory, the whip. To steal was to risk your body and your soul. But still people stole. and in their stories lies the heart of medieval crime. The streets of London were among the most dangerous in all of Europe. In the 13th and 14th centuries, before the dawn of organized policing, the city was a labyrinth of narrow alleys, open sewers, and dim taverns. By day, merchants and craftsmen filled the streets with life. By night, the same lanes became hunting grounds for cut-purses, burglars, and footpads, those who struck from the shadows and vanished just as quickly. Records from the coroner's rolls of London, preserved in faded Latin script, give us glimpses into this dark world. One such entry tells of a woman named Alice Atwater, accused in 1325 of poisoning her husband. Her motive was not greed, but exhaustion. Her husband had beaten her nearly to death for years. In a world where women had few rights and even fewer protections, crime was sometimes the only language left to the powerless. Alice confessed not under interrogation, but under the weight of her own conscience. She was hanged within a week. Her body, like many before her, was left hanging by the city gates, a warning that crime, whether born of necessity or malice, would always be met with steel and rope. But even death did not always bring peace. In the medieval imagination, the criminal's soul lingered. People believed that execution grounds were cursed, that the earth beneath the gallows was unholy. Few dared to walk there after dark, for it was said that the spirits of the condemned wept when the wind blew cold across the fields. Imagine now, as you drift deeper into this story, the creak of wood as the scaffold swayed, the cold wind brushing against your face, carrying the smell of smoke and iron. Each execution was a public spectacle, a grim ritual meant to restore balance between sin and order. The villagers would gather in silence, the priest would speak of repentance, and then the rope would tighten. In those moments, medieval justice showed its most unforgiving face. But beyond these scenes of punishment lay something even more fascinating: the strange, bureaucratic rhythm of crime in the Middle Ages. For every criminal caught, there were records, parchments signed by scribes, listing crimes as varied as sheep theft, blasphemy, forgery, and sorcery. The law was uneven, swayed by status and wealth. A noble might escape with a fine. A peasant might lose a limb. It was not uncommon for criminals to be pardoned if they joined the king's army. The logic was simple. If one was skilled in violence, better that it served the crown. In this way, murderers and thieves became soldiers, and the lines between crime and duty blurred. And then there were those whose crimes were so strange that even chroniclers struggled to define them. In France, for example, a man named Gilles de Rais, once a respected noble and comrade of Joan of Arc, fell into infamy. His story belongs to the later centuries of the Middle Ages, but it remains one of the most horrifying tales of all, a descent from glory into monstrous obsession. De Rais was a man of extraordinary wealth, owning vast estates in Brittany. But after the wars, when glory faded and power waned, he turned inward, consumed by superstition and desire for forbidden knowledge. He began dabbling in alchemy and occultism, believing that he could summon wealth and power from the devil himself. Over time, his crimes became unthinkable. The kidnapping and murder of countless children hidden within his castles. It took years before he was caught, and when he was finally brought to trial in 1440, the proceedings were both a religious and political spectacle. The church sought to cleanse his sins through confession, but the people saw him as something beyond redemption, proof that nobility and corruption could coexist within the same gilded walls. De Ray's execution was public, his repentance carefully recorded by the clergy. But long after his death, rumors persisted that his ghost haunted the ruins of his estate, seeking forgiveness that would never come. As the candle flickers low and shadows move along the walls, you might wonder, was the medieval criminal truly evil, or simply a reflection of the world that made him? In an age without fairness, where survival meant sinning, perhaps morality was a luxury few could afford. The medieval world was full of paradoxes. Monks preached charity while hoarding wealth. Kings declared justice while waging endless wars. And peasants prayed for salvation while stealing grain to live another day.
The night stretches endlessly above the narrow lanes of the medieval city. You can almost hear the soft shuffle of boots over cobblestone, the distant murmur of drunken laughter seeping through wooden shutters, and the faint rattle of chains as the watch makes its slow patrol through the mist. The smell of tallow smoke lingers, mingled with the sour odor of ale and the faint sweetness of baked bread from a baker's dying fire. It is in this half-silence, between the hours when prayers fade and dawn has not yet come, that crime breathes most deeply. To live in a medieval city meant living close to hunger, closer to sickness, and closer still to judgment. The line between sinner and saint was drawn not by morality, but by circumstance. For every man who prayed in the cathedral, another prayed in the shadows, not for forgiveness, but for a chance to eat, to survive another cold night. Among the countless names that filled the rolls of medieval law, few stood out as clearly as Geoffrey Appleby, a thief of London in the mid-1300s. His story is not glorious nor particularly wicked, and that makes it perhaps the most ordinary kind of medieval crime. He was a cooper by trade, a maker of barrels, but after a fire swept through his workshop in the Bishopsgate district, Geoffrey found himself ruined. No one lent money to a man without land, and no guild would take him back once he'd fallen into debt. So he stole. First, small things, a loaf of bread from the docks, a jug of ale from a tavern yard. Then, as hunger hardened into habit, larger things, tools, clothes, coins. He was caught in 1348, during the great pestilence that consumed the city. The coroner's notes record his confession, taken beneath candlelight in a damp cell beneath Newgate Prison. His words survive in translation. "I did steal, not for gain, but for the belly. And if that be sin, then all men sin in hunger." He was hanged 3 days later. His body was left on the city wall for a week before being cut down and buried in a common pit among plague victims and strangers. Yet in that single sentence, one man's plea to be understood, lies the truth of so many forgotten criminals. For the medieval world, crime was not often born of malice, but of desperation, that society refused to see. Outside the city walls, however, crime took on another shape entirely. In the forests and on the lonely roads it grew wild and untamed, a world of bandits, highwaymen, and mercenaries who made their living from the fear of others. Imagine, if you will, the great road between London and York. It stretches for miles across open countryside, lined with hedges and woodland. By day, it was a place of trade and travel. Carts of wool, pilgrims with walking staffs, merchants counting coins. But by night, the road belonged to another order of men. The road thieves of medieval England were organized, clever, and often supported by local villagers who looked the other way. Some even paid for protection, leaving a portion of goods behind for the robbers to take, so the rest might pass unharmed. Records from 1376 tell of Robert Stafford, a gentle thief of Warwickshire. He and his band stopped travelers, not always to rob them, sometimes to demand tolls in the name of the Virgin Mary. They claimed their deeds were holy, that they punished greedy merchants and spared honest pilgrims. But the truth, as always, was murkier. When they were finally captured, it was found they had taken far more from the poor than the rich. Still, their leader escaped death. He took the benefit of clergy, claiming he could read a single verse from the Bible. This loophole was one of the oddest quirks in medieval law. If an accused person could read a line of Scripture, usually Psalm 51, "Have mercy upon me, O God," they could be tried as clergy and spared execution. Many criminals memorized this single line to escape the noose. For some, literacy was salvation. For others, it was proof that law itself was as bendable as the men who wrote it. But for every thief who found mercy, there were others who met darker fates. In Germany, during the 15th century, a secret network of criminals known as the Schwarze Ratten, the Black Rats, terrorized trade routes across the Rhineland. Their crimes went beyond robbery. They kidnapped nobles for ransom, burned tax records, and even murdered priests who refused to pay them tithing. To the authorities, they were nothing short of heretics, enemies not only of the state, but of divine order itself. But even the Black Rats were, in a way, children of their time. The constant wars of the Holy Roman Empire had left thousands of soldiers without homes, without coin, and without cause. These men, trained in violence, turned their swords towards anyone who still possessed wealth. In a Europe divided by feudal lords and endless skirmishes, peace itself became a kind of myth. Those who lived outside the law developed their own hierarchies, crude but functional. They had oaths, leaders, and punishments. Theirs was a brotherhood built not on honor, but on necessity. Betrayal was punished by mutilation. Mercy was rare. But yet, in the ruins of monasteries or along the winding riverbanks, they built small camps, flickering fires where they sang crude songs of freedom and drank stolen ale until dawn. It's almost easy, as you listen now, to imagine the scene. The firelight glimmering on weathered faces, the cold wind stirring the banners of night, and the faint clang of steel as someone sharpens a blade. These were not the romantic outlaws of legend. They were weary men, unwashed, desperate, laughing in the face of a world that had cast them aside. But perhaps the darkest corners of medieval criminality were not found on the open roads nor in the alleys of cities, but within the very walls of castles and courts. Power itself, in those days, was often a cloak for corruption. Kings and nobles committed crimes so vast that no parchment could fully contain them. They plundered, they murdered, they declared holy wars for greed disguised as faith. Yet the chroniclers seldom wrote of these deeds as crimes. They called them politics, or divine right, or simply history. Take, for instance, the Duke of Gloucester, brother to King Richard II of England. He ordered executions without trial, confiscated estates from his rivals, and silenced priests who spoke against him. His enemies called him the Butcher Duke, but no court ever charged him. His power made him untouchable until it did not. In 1397, when Richard II regained control, Gloucester was suddenly arrested, tried in secret, and suffocated under a mattress, an execution as quiet as it was cruel. His death was declared an act of the crown, not a crime, but those who saw it whispered that justice, in the end, had found its way back to the powerful, if only for a moment. Still, not all darkness wore crowns or carried swords. Some hid behind the veil of religion. Throughout Europe, the Church held immense authority, not only over faith, but over law. Monasteries were meant to be sanctuaries of peace and devotion, yet within their cloisters, greed and corruption often festered. There were monks who embezzled church funds, abbots who fathered children in secret, and priests who sold indulgences to the dying for gold. In 1318, the abbess of Wotton was accused of imprisoning a young nun who had fallen pregnant, forcing her into silence and hiding the child's death. The church suppressed the case, but local records preserved enough fragments to reveal the truth. Cruelty could thrive, even within holy walls. These were crimes of silence, hidden beneath robes and hymns, but they were no less real than the cutpurse's blade. As you drift deeper into this world, you might begin to see the medieval criminal not as an outsider, but as a reflection of the world's own hypocrisy. Every layer of society, from the beggar to the bishop, carried its own form of corruption. A merchant might cheat his scales. A noble might order a quiet murder. A scribe might alter a record for a bribe, and all would pray at the same altar, asking the same God for forgiveness. Perhaps that is the truest portrait of the Middle Ages, a world endlessly searching for salvation, yet bound by the same flaws that make us human. The candle is nearly gone now. The room is darker, softer. The faint sound of a distant church bell signals the passing of another hour. You imagine yourself standing once more in the narrow alleyways, the flicker of torchlight dancing across damp stones. Somewhere in that darkness, a shadow moves, the whisper of a name, a breath of crime, a glimpse of survival. Because to live in the medieval world was to live on the edge.
The medieval world, for all its grandeur of cathedrals and castles, was also a world of dread and silence. Behind the splendor of knights and saints, there existed a darker rhythm, one defined by law, punishment, and fear. Every town had its gallows, every village its stocks, and somewhere near every churchyard there was a pit where the condemned were buried. You could not walk far in a medieval town without seeing the symbols of justice. The pillory stood in the market square, a wooden frame where offenders were locked by the neck and wrists, exposed to the jeers of neighbors. For lesser crimes, selling watered wine, cheating a customer, gossiping against a noble, the punishment was humiliation, not death. But humiliation, in a small community, was often worse. Imagine being bound there at dawn, your face reddened by cold and shame. The villagers pass by, some mock, some ignore, a few offer bread out of pity. Time moves slowly when one is watched by all. But for crimes deemed against the peace of the realm, theft, murder, heresy, rebellion, the punishment was more final. The rope, the wheel, the axe, and the fire, these were not mere tools, but messages. Each execution was meant to teach, to remind those who watched that life and law were fragile. In England, the assize courts traveled from town to town, bringing the king's justice to even the most remote shires. The judges arrived with pomp, riding beneath banners, accompanied by scribes and guards. They listened to the accusations, the pleas, the trembling testimonies of peasants who could barely speak in the presence of authority. Most trials lasted minutes. There were no lawyers for the accused, no witnesses for defense. Guilt was assumed unless proven otherwise, and proof, in an age without evidence, was often a matter of rumor or reputation. In some cases, a man might face trial by ordeal, one of the oldest forms of divine testing. The accused might be ordered to plunge his hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. If after 3 days the wound showed no sign of festering, God had judged him innocent. Others were bound and thrown into water. If they sank, they were pure. If they floated, the water had rejected them, proof of guilt. It is difficult now to imagine the stillness of such moments. The crowd watching, the priest murmuring prayers, the man's face pale as he stared at the water that would decide his fate. Justice in those days was not blind, it was divine. And divinity, as many learned, could be terrifyingly silent. Among the darker crimes recorded in the annals of medieval law, few stirred as much fear as murder by poison. Unlike the sword or dagger, poison was unseen, unfought, and often unsuspected. It was the weapon of the educated, of those with access to herbs and knowledge, apothecaries, monks, and sometimes noblewomen. In Florence, during the 14th century, a widow named Francesca di Pitti was accused of poisoning her husband's wine. He had died suddenly after supper, and her servant confessed to buying herbs from a local alchemist. Francesca claimed she had used the herbs to make medicine for her husband's gout, but the court saw deceit. She was sentenced to death by strangulation, not public burning, as her noble blood spared her that humiliation. Her lands were seized, her home confiscated by the city. And yet, years later, records suggest that the apothecary who sold the herbs was also quietly executed, perhaps to silence what he knew. Poison trials were common across Europe, and they reveal a strange truth. Fear of the invisible was greater than fear of the sword. People feared what they could not see, what they could not fight. But perhaps no medieval crime evokes as much fascination and horror as that of bandit kings, men who turned rebellion into livelihood. One such figure was Eustace the monk, a real man who lived between 1170 and 1217. His life reads almost like a fable, part monk, part pirate, part outlaw. Born in Boulogne, France, Eustace joined a Benedictine monastery in his youth, but soon abandoned it after his father was murdered in a political feud. He swore vengeance, left his vows behind, and became first a mercenary, then a pirate, raiding ships across the English Channel. For years, he served both England and France at different times, selling his sword to whoever paid more. Chronicles describe him as a devil in the shape of a monk. His ships terrorized the coastlines, burning villages, seizing merchants, and vanishing into the mist before dawn. In 1217, during the First Barons' War, he was captured in battle off the coast of Sandwich. The English cut off his head and mounted it on a ship's mast as a warning to others. Eustace's story spread across Europe. Some saw him as a villain, others as a folk hero, proof that even a man of God could fall prey to revenge. And beneath that story lies a question. In a time when law itself was often cruel, who was truly the criminal? The man who broke it, or the world that made him? In the quiet of night, such questions linger. The medieval world had many shades of wrongdoing and many shades of punishment, but not all criminals were thieves or killers. They were thinkers, dreamers, or heretics who dared to speak differently. To the medieval church, heresy, the crime of believing wrongly, was among the gravest of all offenses. It was not merely disobedience, it was rebellion against truth itself. And in a world where faith and authority were inseparable, that rebellion threatened everything. The story of Marguerite Poré stands as one of the most haunting examples. She was a French mystic, author of The Mirror of Simple Souls, a book that spoke of divine love beyond the Church's control. Marguerite taught that true faith was not found in priests or sacraments, but within the individual soul. Her words, written in Old French, spread quietly among the devout, until they reached the wrong ears. In 1308, she was arrested by the Inquisition in Paris. For over a year, she refused to recant her writings. She spoke only to say that her soul belonged to God, not men.
On June 1st, 1310, Marguerite was burned at the stake in the Place de Grève, the same square where thieves and traitors met their end. Chroniclers wrote that she did not scream. Her crime was not theft or murder, but belief, a dangerous belief that the soul could be free even when the body was bound. The medieval world was filled with such contradictions. A thief might be hanged for stealing a loaf of bread, while a nobleman might slaughter peasants without consequence. A woman could die for her words, while a knight might earn glory for the same cruelty under another name. Justice was less a principle and more a performance, a way of reminding the poor that order existed, even if mercy did not. In France, during the 15th century, the court of Charles the Bold made an art of punishment. Executions were staged in public squares, accompanied by priests chanting psalms, soldiers maintaining silence, and the smell of incense mingling with burning flesh. The condemned were often forced to confess publicly before dying, their final words written down by clerks. These confessions were later read in churches as cautionary tales. Yet behind the ceremony, many sentences were motivated by political greed or personal vengeance. A rival might be branded a heretic. A debt might be erased by calling it treason. For those who lived under such rule, the safest life was one of invisibility, obedience, silence, and prayer. Still, even in such a grim world, there existed strange forms of compassion. In some towns, the condemned were offered a cup of ale before hanging, the gallows draught. It was said to calm the nerves and ease the passage to death. The executioner, too, might whisper a prayer, asking forgiveness before tightening the noose. And when night fell, some families dared to retrieve the bodies of their loved ones in secret, burying them quietly in unmarked ground beyond consecrated soil. In those acts, small, defiant, deeply human, the medieval world showed glimpses of tenderness beneath its iron laws. As you drift deeper into the rhythm of this time, imagine yourself standing before the gallows at dawn. The air is cold and damp. The crowd gathers slowly, wrapped in cloaks.
Take a deep breath. Let the quiet hum of time surround you, and allow your mind to wander back through the stone corridors of the medieval world, where punishment was not only justice, but theater, ritual, and fear woven into the fabric of daily life. The dungeon was never designed to be seen. Its entrance was often hidden beneath a stairwell, behind an iron door, or down a winding path that smelled of mold and damp stone. You could pass 100 times through the grand hall of a castle and never know that, just beneath your feet, men whispered in the dark, forgotten, half alive, and waiting for something that would never come. In medieval Europe, the concept of the prison was not as we imagine it today. It was not meant for long sentences or reform. It was a place of waiting, for trial, for ransom, or for death. A thief might spend weeks there before facing the gallows, a captured knight months until his family could pay, and a heretic years until his confession pleased his inquisitors. But even in these grim places, there was a hierarchy. Noble captives might have a small chamber, perhaps even a straw bed and a candle. Commoners were chained in low, wet cells, their ankles rubbed raw by iron shackles, their food little more than water and stale bread. The sound of dripping water, the scurrying of rats, the muffled cries of others, these were their companions. In the Tower of London, for instance, the deeper chambers were said to be so cold and airless that torches could barely burn. Prisoners there scratched messages into the walls, prayers, names, desperate appeals to God.
Some of these carvings remain to this day. Crosses, initials, and crude figures of men kneeling before angels. One inscription, carved by a doomed prisoner in the 16th century, reads simply, "My hope is in Christ, though I see him not." That was centuries after the height of the medieval age, but the sentiment is timeless. Faith was often the only warmth a prisoner could carry with him. And yet, faith too could be dangerous. The Church's prisons were among the most feared of all. The Inquisition, which rose in the 13th century, maintained a network of secret chambers throughout France, Spain, and Italy, cold, silent places where the accused were not merely confined but questioned, prodded, and reshaped into obedience. They called it interrogatio, inquiry. But to those who endured it, it was something else entirely. There were methods, carefully recorded, even approved by law, designed to extract truth from the unwilling. They were not chaotic acts of rage, as one might think, but slow, deliberate procedures carried out by men who believed they served righteousness. A confession, after all, was the most valuable thing a judge could possess. It was proof not just of guilt, but of the system's divine order. And so the rack was turned. The thumbscrews tightened. The iron boots heated until bone and iron sang together. The accused were often asked the same questions over and over. Who helped you? Who conspired with you? What did you believe? If they named others, the chain grew longer. If they stayed silent, the pain grew sharper. The torturers prayed before and after their work. Many saw themselves not as monsters, but as physicians of the soul, healing heresy with suffering. The Inquisition even had rules. No blood was to be drawn, no limbs permanently broken, and no life taken, at least not within the prison walls. Death came later, at the hands of secular law. And yet thousands died beneath those rules, from infection, despair, or the simple will to stop breathing. One of the most notorious sites of such questioning was the L'Inquisition de Carcassonne in southern France. There the cells were carved directly into the limestone beneath the city. Some were so small that a man could not stand fully upright. Others were shared by half a dozen captives. Chroniclers tell of prisoners who sang hymns in the dark to keep their sanity. Their voices, echoing through the tunnels, became a kind of ghostly choir. When dawn broke, a friar might descend carrying a torch, a loaf of bread, and a quill to record confessions. Many, unable to bear the thought of another day, confessed to anything. It was not truth the inquisitors sought, it was obedience, the reassurance that the world remained in order, that God's law had triumphed over human doubt. And so, in the cold silence of Carcassonne, truth itself became a casualty. But not all prisons were places of punishment. Some, strangely, were places of protection. In medieval cities, when an accused man feared mob justice or a vengeful lord, he could claim sanctuary in a church. Crossing the threshold of holy ground placed him under divine protection. The idea dated back to ancient law, but in the Middle Ages it became both respected and abused. A thief might flee to a cathedral, grasp the altar, and demand safety. The authorities could not touch him without risking excommunication. For 40 days he might live within the church, eating scraps offered by the clergy, sleeping beneath vaulted ceilings. Some used this time to confess, others used it to plan escape. At the end of 40 days, he had two choices: surrender to justice or take exile, leaving the realm forever. It is said that in some churches, footprints carved into the floor mark where fugitives stood as they begged the priest for mercy. The contrast was stark. Outside, the iron and fire of justice. Inside, the trembling promise of grace. And yet, even mercy had its limits. By the 14th century, sanctuary was increasingly abused, thieves and killers using the church as a shield. Kings began to resent the loss of their authority. Laws were passed to restrict who could claim it, and under what crimes. Still, in the dead of night, there were always those who fled to the churchyard, banging on the wooden doors, crying for sanctuary, while torches flickered behind them. Some were let in. Others were not. And as the centuries passed, that sacred refuge, once a cornerstone of medieval mercy, faded into myth. The truth is, crime in the medieval world was rarely clean or simple. It was tangled in superstition, desperation, and survival. A starving peasant who stole grain was a criminal. A nobleman who raised taxes to the point of famine was not. A woman who brewed herbs to ease pain could be branded a witch. A monk who sold holy cures for profit was praised for his devotion. The world was drawn in lines of class and faith, and crime, more often than not, was defined by who had the power to name it. Yet beneath this brutal order, there were also men and women who resisted quietly, who refused to confess, who helped the condemned escape, who smuggled food into prisons or carried messages to families. Their names were rarely recorded, but they existed everywhere, in abbeys, in inns, in the shadowed corners of the marketplace. One English legend tells of a blacksmith in York who forged false keys for dungeon doors, freeing 2 innocent boys accused of witchcraft. The boys vanished into the countryside. The blacksmith was caught and hanged. But long after, people whispered that the sound of hammering could still be heard from his old workshop, as though his spirit continued to strike against the iron of injustice. These were not just stories of cruelty. They were the stories of a civilization struggling to define morality. A world without fingerprints, without juries, without the notion of equality. A man's life could be weighed against the word of a noble or the whisper of a neighbor. A woman's fate could turn on whether her herbs healed or harmed. Yet somehow, through this slow grinding of fear and faith, came the early roots of modern law. Ideas of fairness, of written records, of evidence and testimony. The cost of those ideas was measured in lives, thousands of them, hanging silent in the margins of history. As the candle burns lower and the shadows lengthen on the stone walls, imagine yourself again in that medieval cell. You hear footsteps above, the muffled thud of boots, the echo of a priest's chant. Somewhere far away, a bell tolls for matins, marking the hour before dawn.
The word outlaw carries a strange kind of poetry. In the medieval mind, it did not simply mean criminal. It meant outside the law, a person cast beyond the protection of the king, stripped of rights, fair trial, and safety. To kill an outlaw was not murder, it was justice. To shelter one was to defy the crown. Yet many who became outlaws were not villains at all. They were men and women caught between hunger and authority, between loyalty and survival. A tax unpaid, a fight turned deadly, a lord offended. That was often all it took. And once declared an outlaw, there was no return. The forests became both refuge and prison. Imagine for a moment that you are standing at the edge of Sherwood Forest. Not the romantic Sherwood of songs and films, but the real one, vast, cold, and wild. The oaks stretch high above you, their roots snaking through the soil like veins. The air smells of damp earth and wood smoke. You hear distant movement, a horse perhaps, or the creak of a bowstring. This is where fugitives fled. Men like Robin Hood, though his true identity remains uncertain, and countless others whose names have been lost to the moss and time. These forests were alive with whispers. Peasants spoke of bands of thieves who robbed tax collectors, who gave bread to the poor, who dared to mock the king's men. But reality was more complex. Some outlaws were indeed rebels against cruelty. Others were merely desperate. Bandits surviving off travelers, mercenaries turned thieves after war, soldiers left unpaid when their lord fell. Each tree might shelter a saint or a murderer, and no one, not even the sheriff, could tell the difference. The laws of the forest were their own kind. The trees muffled sound, and justice there moved slowly, if at all. A man could vanish into the green shadows for months, living off stolen meat, sleeping beneath branches, always listening for the horns of pursuit. Those horns, short, sharp blasts of sound, could echo for miles. They meant the sheriff's men were near. To be caught was to die, usually without trial. Outlaws were hanged where they stood, their bodies left swaying as warnings. But still, the forests never emptied. For many, life in the trees, wild and uncertain, was kinder than life under feudal rule. In 1322, a chronicler in Yorkshire described a group called the Company of Wakefield, 40 men armed with bows, daggers, and cudgels who attacked toll collectors along the Great North Road. They ambushed wagons, stole wool and grain, and disappeared into the woods before soldiers arrived. When caught, their leader, a man named Richard Lescrope, was not tried as a thief, but as a traitor. He had stolen from the king's treasury. His body was hung in chains above the road, to rot where travelers could see him. For months, ravens circled his bones. Yet strangely, his name spread in songs, sung quietly in taverns. To the poor, he became a kind of legend, a man who took from the powerful and suffered for it. And so began a strange pattern in medieval memory, the criminal as hero. It wasn't just England. Across Europe, the same figures appeared, part villain, part rebel, part martyr. In Germany, the Rauglister, or robber knights, terrorized trade routes. They were noblemen by birth, but thieves by action, raiding merchants, capturing travelers, and holding them for ransom in crumbling castles. These robber lords claimed that poverty drove them to it, the decline of feudalism, the shrinking of land rights, the endless taxes demanded by emperors and bishops. But they also enjoyed the spectacle of defiance. Some built secret dungeons in their keeps. Others flew banners showing broken chains or black crosses, symbols of rebellion against imperial order. For a time, the line between noble and criminal blurred completely. A man could dine with bishops one night and burn a village the next. And the peasants, crushed between both, learned to fear anyone on horseback. But in every age of oppression, there are those who fight back in quieter ways. In small villages, women often became the unseen keepers of resistance. A loaf of bread left by the road, a blanket hung from a tree. These were signals to those hiding in the woods. A stolen horse might vanish overnight, replaced the next morning with a handful of coins left in a church pew. Such acts were not heroic in the songs, but they were the pulse of compassion that kept rebellion alive. One 14th-century priest, writing anonymously from Lincolnshire, noted in his parish book, "There are those among my flock who give to thieves, yet they sin less than those who take from the poor in daylight." It was a dangerous statement, one that could have cost him his life, but it tells us something profound about the medieval conscience. Even then, amid chains and gallows, people recognized that crime and justice were not the same thing. And yet, many outlaws were far from noble. Some were violent and merciless. Gangs who slaughtered travelers for a few silver coins or burned entire farms for shelter. In France, during the chaos of the 100 Years' War, these men were called routiers, former soldiers turned marauders. They roamed the countryside in companies of 50 or more, wearing stolen armor and carrying banners from fallen armies. They extorted villages, demanding food, drink, and protection money. Those who refused were punished brutally. Houses burned, families taken hostage. When peace came, they didn't stop. They had no trade but war, no skill but violence. Chroniclers called them the wolves of the road. And for peasants, it was almost impossible to tell whether the men who rode toward them were knights or killers. Both wore mail, both bore swords, both claimed divine right. In this confusion, justice dissolved entirely. If you lived in that time, you might wake one morning to find a stranger knocking on your cottage door. He wears a torn surcoat of a soldier, a cross half faded on his chest. His beard is unshaven, his eyes hollow with hunger. He asks for bread, calling himself a pilgrim. You give him what you can, a crust, a bowl of broth. And he nods, leaving silently. But that night others come. Men dressed like him, only armed. They break your door, take your grain, your goat, your only blanket. They tell you this is justice, payment for the Lord's war. When they're gone, you find a small emblem carved into your door, a crooked dagger, a warning. You say nothing, because to speak is to invite the gallows. And thus the cycle of silence continues. By the late medieval period, as kingdoms grew stronger and armies more centralized, these independent bands began to fade. But the fear they created lingered for generations. Villages built stone crosses at crossroads, not just as holy symbols, but as talismans against thieves. Travelers rode in groups, carrying bells to signal their approach. In some places, towns paid thief's gold, small tributes left secretly to buy safety from local outlaws. You might think of it as corruption. They thought of it as survival. The medieval world, in truth, was not divided neatly between good and evil. It was a web of needs, of hunger, faith, pride, and fear. Even those who robbed or killed often did so under the same banner as kings and crusaders.
The forest fades behind you now,
replaced by the echoing sound of iron boots on stone. The air grows colder, heavier. It smells of soot, sweat, and fear. You're standing in the heart of a medieval town, at dawn, when the streets are still damp from the night rain and only the crows are awake. It's execution day. Not far from you, the townsfolk are already gathering. Children perch on barrels, women hold small loaves of bread in their hands, men murmur among themselves, pretending they are here to witness justice. But you can feel it, the mix of curiosity and dread that always accompanied public punishment. For centuries, this was what justice looked like in the medieval world. Not a quiet courtroom or a sealed verdict, but a spectacle, a performance meant to terrify, to instruct, and to remind everyone of the cost of disobedience. And at the center of it all stood one man, the executioner. His name was rarely spoken aloud. In many towns, he was simply called the Master of the Sword, the Hangman, or the Dark Servant. He lived on the edge of society, both needed and despised. He was the hand of the law, but also its shame. Children were warned not to touch his shadow. No one broke bread with him. In some regions, executioners could only marry within their own families, for no one else would have them. And yet, on mornings like this, all eyes were on him. He would arrive early, his clothes practical, thick leather gloves, a hood or scarf, boots coated in ash to dull their shine. He would inspect the rope, the block, the blade. Everything had to be precise. A single mistake could turn justice into chaos. In the 13th century, an English chronicler described the hangman of York, a man named Robert of Tyburn. He was said to have the calmest hands in England, able to cut cleanly through a neck with one stroke. For this, the sheriff paid him more than a mason earned in a month. But Robert lived alone, outside the city walls, near the marshes where the air was heavy and insects thrived. He was seen only on days like this, when justice demanded blood. Once a traveler claimed to have visited his hut. He found the executioner sitting by the fire, sharpening his axe, whispering softly to it like one might speak to an animal. When asked why he did so, Robert replied, "Steel listens better than men, and it remembers what it's fed." It said that traveler never went back. The role of the executioner was both sacred and cursed. In some places, they were required to pray before every act, asking for divine strength to separate the soul from the body cleanly. In others, they drank heavily before the work, not out of pleasure, but to numb the trembling in their hands. When executions went wrong, when a rope broke or a blade failed, it was not the condemned who suffered alone. The executioner, too, was sometimes punished, even killed by the crowd. This was not uncommon. The boundary between justice and rage was razor thin. The most feared of all medieval punishment was not hanging or beheading, it was drawing and quartering, a sentence reserved for traitors against the crown. To modern ears, it sounds almost unimaginable, but to medieval spectators, it was the ultimate proof of royal authority. The condemned would be tied to a horse and dragged through the streets, their bodies scraping against the cobbles, the jeers of the crowd rising like waves. They were then hung until near death, but not killed. The rope was cut, the body lowered, the belly opened with a knife. The heart, the lungs, the entrails, all removed before the final act. It was both punishment and warning, carved into living flesh. Those who witnessed it often described feeling ill for days afterward, yet they still came, because in a world ruled by fear, seeing justice was a way to survive it. In France, during the reign of King Philip IV, executions were carefully staged affairs. The scaffold would be built in the marketplace, surrounded by banners bearing the royal crest. Monks would chant psalms as the condemned was brought forth. The executioner bowed to the king's representative before lifting his sword, an act of ceremony as much as cruelty. Each stroke was meant to affirm order, to say, "This is what happens when you defy power." And yet the king's justice could be as fickle as the wind. Many of those killed were not criminals in any true sense. They were victims of politics, nobles who fell from favor, priests who questioned doctrine, peasants accused of theft when famine made them desperate. Justice, in this sense, was not a principle, but a performance, one that both frightened and united the people who watched. The scaffold became a kind of theater. Merchants sold bread and cider nearby. Travelers who had arrived the night before found good viewing spots. Some even brought their children to teach them what happens to the wicked. There were prayers, of course, but also laughter. And that laughter, cold and nervous, is what frightened chroniclers most, because it showed how accustomed people had become to cruelty. A monk from Canterbury wrote in 1350, "When men cheer for death, they forget their own souls." He wasn't wrong. But punishment was not always public. Some crimes demanded secrecy, not because they were too shocking, but because they were too shameful. In the dungeons beneath castles and city walls, quieter sentences unfolded. Here you would find the wheel, the stocks, the pillory. The wheel especially was a symbol of torment, a massive wooden frame upon which the body was broken, limb by limb, with an iron bar. It was slow, deliberate, and meant to send a message not through words, but through screams. The pillory, by contrast, was less deadly, but more humiliating. It was placed in the center of town, where offenders, thieves, adulterers, blasphemers were locked for hours or days. They could not move. They could not defend themselves. Passers-by threw rotten fruit, mud, stones. Children spat, women scolded them. And yet some people later said that the pillory was worse than the gallows because it killed not the body, but the dignity. Still, for every act of cruelty, there were moments of mercy. Executioners were not always heartless. Some were known to whisper prayers over the condemned or to promise a swift stroke in exchange for forgiveness. In 1423, in the city of Ghent, a woman condemned for theft reportedly gave the hangman her only ring, a small copper band. He wept, they said, before tightening the noose. He made sure she died quickly. That same hangman was later dismissed for refusing to execute a child. His name has been lost, but his story lingers in the margins of a parish book, a small act of compassion in an age that had little room for it. It's tempting, when looking back, to judge these people harshly. But imagine a world where life expectancy rarely passed 40, where famine and plague were constant companions, and where the only thing standing between chaos and order was fear. Fear was the glue that held society together, and punishment, visible, tangible, unforgettable, was the tool that created it. Even kings were haunted by it. Edward I of England, known for his ruthless laws, reportedly wept after watching an execution. He said, "We rule by dread and are its slaves." That sentence, recorded by a monk, might be the truest reflection of medieval justice ever written. As the day fades and the crowd drifts away from the scaffold,
the square grows quiet again. The executioner packs his tools, rope coiled nicely, blade wrapped in cloth. The priest murmurs a final blessing over the blood-stained ground. Tomorrow, life will continue as before. Markets will reopen, bells will ring again, children will laugh again. But the echo of the gallows lingers, in the silence, in the smell of smoke, in the heavy stillness that follows violence. It's a reminder that justice, in the medieval world, was not about fairness. It was about fear. But perhaps that fear was not entirely wasted. It kept kings cautious. It kept rebels wary. It shaped the long, painful.
The light fades once more, and the world around you changes. The bustling square and the distant cries of the crowd dissolve into something quieter, something heavier. You are standing now before the gates of a medieval prison. Its walls are made of rough, unpolished stone, slick with moss and moisture. Iron spikes crown the entrance, and a small torch burns weakly near the doorway, struggling against the night wind. This is not the kind of prison you know. There are no barred cells lined neatly in rows, no guards in uniform, no echo of clanging keys down a clean corridor. Instead, what surrounds you is closer to a dungeon, a dark, damp place where air grows stale and men forget what sunlight feels like. Here, punishment was not swift. It was slow. It was deliberate. And it was meant not only to restrain, but to break. You hear it before you see it. The faint drip of water, the soft rustle of rats scurrying through straw, the moan of someone too weak to move. You step closer. The heavy door groans open, and the smell hits you. A mix of mold, iron, and decay. The guard at the entrance barely glances your way. He's wearing a cloak stiff with sweat and age, and he carries a torch whose flame flickers in his shaking hand. He mutters something under his breath, a prayer perhaps, before leading you down the narrow passage. The walls close in, the air grows colder, and the sound of dripping water seems to follow every step. In the medieval world, prisons were not what they would later become. They were not meant to reform anyone. They were holding places, temporary waiting rooms between life and death, guilt and judgment, freedom and execution. Most people were not imprisoned for years. They were kept just long enough for a confession, a ransom, or a verdict. But for those who lingered, debtors, traitors, heretics, or political prisoners, time itself became a punishment. The most infamous of these prisons stood at the heart of cities, symbols of power and fear. There was Newgate Prison in London, a place so notorious that even its name became a curse. Built in the 12th century, it was originally meant to hold only a handful of prisoners. By the 14th century, it held hundreds, crammed into spaces barely fit for animals. The stench was unbearable. The food, if one could call it that, was often nothing more than scraps of moldy bread and thin broth. Rats were everywhere, crawling over sleeping bodies, gnawing through clothes and flesh alike. Disease spread faster than the guards could keep track. Typhus, dysentery, fever. Each cell was its own small kingdom of misery. And yet, amid all this, life continued. If you look closely through the dim torchlight, you'll see it. A man hunched in the corner, whispering to himself. A woman clutching a wooden cross, her lips moving in silent prayer. A boy, no older than 16, carving lines into the wall, counting the days he has survived. They do not scream anymore. They do not beg. They exist in a kind of stillness that comes only when pain becomes too familiar to notice. Some sing softly in the night, hymns, lullabies, fragments of songs they once knew as children. The echoes of their voices rise and fall like the wind through a crypt. For them, the dungeon is not just a place, it's a memory that never ends. Further inside, the cells grow smaller and the air colder. You pass by one that seems almost swallowed by darkness. A faint figure stirs within, his beard matted, his eyes hollow, his skin pale as candle wax. He was once a noble, you were told, a man who fell from favor, who plotted against his lord, and was found guilty of treason. He's been here for 9 years. His chains have worn grooves into his wrists and ankles. His speech has turned slow, hesitant, as though language itself has become a foreign thing. When the guard asks if he wishes for confession, the man simply smiles, not cruelly, but distantly, as though the words no longer mean anything. There is a kind of peace in him, the terrible kind that comes when all hope has long since burned away. In the corner cell, a woman rocks back and forth, her hair tangled, her dress little more than rags. She was accused of witchcraft, though no one remembers the details anymore. Someone said she caused a cow to die. Someone else swore they saw her speaking to a crow. That was enough. She's been kept here for months, waiting for the bishop to decide her fate. In the flicker of torchlight, you can see her hands trembling, her eyes darting to the small flame, as though it might vanish at any moment. When she sees you, she whispers something, too softly to hear, but her tone is pleading, not angry. Perhaps she's asking for water, or perhaps she's asking to be remembered. In the deepest part of the dungeon lies what the guards call the oubliette. The name comes from the French word oublier, which means to forget. And that is exactly what it was designed to do. An oubliette was a vertical pit, often carved into stone and accessible only through a narrow opening in the ceiling. Prisoners were lowered into it with ropes, then left there, sometimes for days, sometimes forever. There was no light, no floor, no space to lie down, only darkness, dampness, and the slow dripping of water that measured time in agony. If you fell ill or fainted, no one noticed. If you died, your body remained until the next unfortunate soul was thrown in. Some oubliettes were so deep that voices could not travel back up. Others were shallow enough for the faint sound of screams to reach the guard room, where men pretended not to hear. It was said that the silence of the oubliette could drive a man mad faster than any torture. And maybe that was the point. Not all medieval prisons were built for cruelty. Some were born of necessity, makeshift jails within castles or monasteries where wrongdoers were kept under watch. But even those were far from humane. In monastic prisons, for example, silence was absolute. The condemned monk or nun would be locked in a bare cell, fed on bread and water, and made to pray endlessly for forgiveness. Some would carve prayers into the walls over and over again, until the stone itself seemed to whisper them back. One such inscription was found centuries later in a Benedictine abbey. "May God remember me, for I have forgotten myself." It was etched so faintly, It almost disappeared under the moss. In the Ottoman Empire, prisoners sometimes fared no better. Those accused of rebellion or theft were held in fortress towers, chained to iron rings embedded in the wall. In Constantinople, the Yedikule fortress, known as the Fortress of Seven Towers, became infamous for its dungeons. There, prisoners described hearing footsteps echoing at night, even when no guards were near. The walls were thick, yet the cries of men would still travel through the stone, carried, some said, by the spirits of those who died before. Even the wealthy could find themselves here. Ambassadors, generals, and once loyal courtiers all learned how fragile power could be when walls closed around you. You walk further, and the air changes. It grows colder still, but sharper, as though it carries a kind of truth within it. The truth is this: these prisons were not designed merely to punish crimes. They were designed to enforce obedience. Every creak of the chain, every cough in the dark, every whisper of despair reminded those outside what awaited them if they defied the system. And in this way, the dungeon became not just a place, but an idea, one that lived in the minds of everyone who feared its depths. But not all stories that began in darkness ended there.
The dungeon door closes behind you, the sound echoing through the thick stone corridors. The torchlight flickers weakly as you follow a narrow passage that twists downward. You can feel the cold pressing closer now, the kind of cold that seems to live in the walls themselves, seeping into your bones. You've seen the prisoners. You've smelled the decay, heard the whispers of the forgotten. But there is another layer to this place, one not often spoken of in chronicles or church records. It's the layer of those who kept watch, the jailers. They were neither free nor condemned. They lived in the space between, walking the same corridors day and night, their only company the echoes of misery and the constant scrape of metal chains. They were men of contradictions, loyal yet despised, powerful yet imprisoned by duty. Their world was small: the gate, the torch, the sound of keys jingling against their belts. But inside that small world, they carried great weight, the burden of deciding, every hour, how much suffering was enough. Imagine one such man. His name might be forgotten, but his shape is easy to picture. His cloak is heavy with grime. His hands are calloused and cracked from years of gripping cold iron. His eyes are neither cruel nor kind, only tired, the kind of tiredness that no sleep can cure. He wakes before dawn, when the prison is at its quietest. The fires in the hearth have burned low, leaving only embers. The rats move freely now, their small claws scratching against stone. The jailer lights a fresh torch and begins his rounds. He doesn't rush. There is nowhere to go, after all. He passes by the cells one by one, checking that the chains remain locked, that no prisoner has escaped into the cracks or shadows. Sometimes he pauses, listening for breathing, slow, ragged, faint. When he finds none, he marks a symbol on the wall outside the cell. It means that someone will need to be removed in the morning. He doesn't flinch anymore when he writes that mark. In some prisons, the jailer was not merely a guard.
He was an executioner, a messenger, a servant, and sometimes even a torturer. In England's Newgate, for example, the line between jailer and hangman was almost invisible. The man who fed you your last meal might also be the one who tied the rope around your neck. And yet their lives were far from easy. Jailers were often despised by the very towns they served. They lived in rooms attached to the prison, damp, narrow spaces where the stench of decay never fully left. Their families, if they had any, endured the same smell, the same fear. Many grew ill before reaching old age. The diseases of the prisoners did not respect iron bars. Fever, infection, and madness spread easily. Some became drunks, their minds dulled by ale and despair. Others turned cruel, using violence to feel control in a place that stripped everyone of it. But a few, a rare few, tried to show mercy. There is a record, written in the 15th century, of a man named Thomas of Norwich, a keeper at a debtor's prison. He was known among the inmates as the kindly jailer. It was said that he often slipped bits of bread to those who could not afford food, or let prisoners breathe fresh air at dawn when the guards weren't watching. He claimed to have once been a prisoner himself, and perhaps that explained his compassion. But such mercy came with a cost. When word of his leniency reached the magistrates, he was accused of negligence and dismissed. No one knows what became of him afterward. Some say he left the city. Others believe he returned to the same cell he once guarded, this time as a debtor himself. History is quiet on his fate, as it is for so many men who lived unseen in the shadow of greater cruelty. In the Ottoman Empire, the keepers of prisons were often eunuchs or soldiers bound by strict obedience to the Sultan's will. Their loyalty was absolute, yet their role was perilous. If a prisoner escaped or died too soon, punishment could fall on the jailer's head, sometimes quite literally. There is an account from the 16th century of a man named Hassan Aga, keeper of the Yedikul dungeons in Constantinople. He was known for his silence. Prisoners would say that he never spoke a word, even when delivering food or orders. His face was unreadable, his eyes cold as the stone he lived among. But one winter, when a nobleman from Wallachia was thrown into his care, something changed. The nobleman was accused of treason, a false charge, perhaps, but one that would cost him everything. Hassan Aga, bound by duty, did his work as always. Yet over time he began leaving small offerings at the prisoner's cell door, a scrap of clean cloth, a slice of bread still warm from the kitchen, a cup of fresh water. No one noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. When spring came, the nobleman was executed, and Hassan Aga, it was said, refused to eat for 7 days afterward. When his body was found in his chamber, his hands were clasped around a rosary that was not his own. The story spread quietly among the guards, but it was never written in any official record, because the empire had no place for the weaknesses of its servants. In every dungeon, there existed a strange intimacy between prisoner and jailer. One held the keys, the other bore the chains, but both were trapped in the same silence, breathing the same foul air, counting the same endless hours. They spoke to each other when no one was watching. They shared fragments of stories, memories of sunlight, verses of forgotten prayers. The jailer might ask where the prisoner was from. The prisoner might ask the jailer if he had ever seen the sea. These small exchanges meant little in the grand scheme of history, yet within the confines of those walls they were everything, a reminder that both men were still human. In the city of Florence, records from the early 1400s mention a jailer who kept a small book of names. He would write the name of every prisoner who died in his custody, along with a few words of remembrance. A thief, a woman who sang, a poor boy. No one ordered him to do it. When he himself passed away, the book was found among his possessions, wrapped in linen. It contained hundreds of entries. No commentary, no dates, just names. It was as though he wanted someone someday to remember that they existed. Perhaps that was his act of redemption. Outside the dungeons, the rest of the world went on. Kings rose and fell. Wars began and ended. Cathedrals were built and empires expanded. But down here, in the stone-bellied heart of each city, time hardly moved. You can imagine the jailer sitting by his torchlight at night, his head bowed, his hand resting on the ring of keys beside him. He doesn't sleep much. The cries and moans echo through the corridors, sometimes rising, sometimes fading into silence. He tries to pray, but the words come hollow. He wonders, not for the first time, if God can hear those who live beneath the earth.
You emerge from the damp echo of the dungeon into the pale light of morning. For a moment, the air feels sharp, almost sweet, though it carries the faint scent of ash and sweat from the town beyond. Above you, the world of the living stirs. Merchants are setting up their stalls in the marketplace. Horses clatter over cobblestones slick with dew. A baker's apprentice calls out to his master, his hands dusted white with flour. But today, the crowd is gathering for something else. Today is a day of justice. In the medieval world, justice was not confined to parchment and courthouses. It was a performance, a ritual, a warning, a grim form of theater that turned the streets into a stage. Every hanging, every burning, every beheading was meant to be seen. To watch was to learn, and to learn was to obey. For the rulers of that time, fear was more dependable than love. You make your way through the growing throng. The people are murmuring, tradesmen, peasants, beggars, even children clutching their mothers' skirts. They talk in hushed tones about who will be executed today. Rumors travel faster than truth. Some say the condemned man murdered a priest. Others say he merely stole a loaf of bread. No one really knows. But the crowd has come anyway, drawn by the same mixture of curiosity and dread that has always followed human cruelty. The gallows stand tall in the center of the square, a crude wooden frame darkened by years of use. Beneath it lies the sawdust meant to soak up the blood. Nearby, a wooden platform has been built for the magistrates,
robed men who will watch from a safe distance, their faces unreadable. The condemned is brought forward. He is thin, his face pale, his eyes wide with the kind of fear that no words can disguise. His wrists are bound, his steps clumsy. A priest follows behind him, murmuring prayers, the sound swallowed by the murmur of the crowd. The executioner waits at the gallows. His face is hidden beneath a hood. His hands are steady. He has done this many times before. Executioners were strange figures in medieval society, both feared and necessary. They lived at the edge of towns, often shunned, their children forbidden to marry into respectable families. Yet without them, the machinery of justice could not turn. In France, they were called bourreaux. In England, hangmen. In the Holy Roman Empire, they were sometimes known simply as Meister Hans, a professional title passed down through generations. Their work was precise, almost ritualistic. They sharpened their blades with care, measured the length of rope to ensure a swift end, and followed the laws of death with the same attention that a monk gave to his prayers. But not every execution went as planned. There were botched hangings, where the condemned kicked and twisted for long minutes as the crowd looked on. There were beheadings where the axe missed its mark, and the headsman had to strike again and again. And there were burnings, where the fire refused to take it first, and someone had to step forward with a torch to make it rise higher. Each mistake was a lesson in the fragility of life and the cruelty of spectacle. You can almost hear the sound now, the dull murmur fading into silence as the prisoner mounts the steps. The rope creaks softly, swaying in the morning air. The magistrate reads the charges. The words are formal, distant, rehearsed. By the laws of the realm and by the judgment of the court, you are found guilty of crimes against the crown and the church. The rest blurs. The meaning is already known. The condemned whispers something, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse. And then the lever is pulled. The sound is abrupt, a single heavy thud. The body drops, the crowd gasps, and for a moment all is still. Then the murmuring begins again, as if nothing has changed. The executioner steps forward, checks for breath, and when he finds none, he nods once. The priest closes his book. The magistrates turn away, and the people begin to scatter, back to their daily lives, as if they hadn't just witnessed the end of one. Executions were not just punishments, they were lessons carved into public memory. In London, the bodies of traitors were often displayed at city gates, their heads placed on spikes to rot in the sun. The most infamous spot was London Bridge, where the heads of rebels and heretics stared down at passers-by, blackened by weather and time. In Nuremberg, the same was done with thieves and killers, their corpses left to hang as a warning to others. In Paris, the Gibet de Montfaucon loomed over the horizon, a towering structure where hundreds of bodies could be displayed at once. It was said that you could smell it long before you saw it. But the spectacle of death also had another side, a strange, almost spiritual fascination. Many believed that witnessing an execution could cleanse the soul or bring one closer to God. People took relics from the condemned, a piece of the rope, a lock of hair, even a drop of blood. These objects were thought to have power, the power to heal, to protect, to ward off sin. In time, execution days became almost festive occasions. Vendors sold pastries and wine, musicians played, children climbed on barrels to see better.
It was a grim carnival, the celebration of punishment wrapped in the ordinary rhythm of life. And yet, beneath the noise and color, something darker stirred. Because the line between justice and cruelty was never clear. For every murderer or thief punished in the square, there were others, beggars, dissenters, even healers, condemned for reasons that had nothing to do with guilt. The medieval world feared chaos above all things, and fear made easy targets. A woman with herbs could become a witch. A poor man who spoke too freely could be a traitor. A stranger who prayed differently could be branded a heretic. And when such people were led to their deaths, the crowd rarely questioned it. They simply watched, and nodded, and told themselves that order had been restored. But sometimes the executioner himself questioned the system he served. There are letters, few but haunting, written by executioners who confessed their doubts. In one, a man named Franz Schmidt, who served as an executioner in 16th-century Nuremberg, wrote in his diary about the toll his profession took on his soul. He had executed 361 people during his career, thieves, murderers, witches. Yet he wrote that he prayed for each of them before raising his sword, and afterward he would visit the church to ask forgiveness. He saw his work not as cruelty, but as duty, a service to God and to justice. And still, in his final entry, he admitted that sometimes, late at night, he could hear their voices, not in his ears, but in his dreams. As you stand in that square, watching the gallows being dismantled, you realize something. Justice in this time was not about truth, it was about control. The fear of punishment was the thread that kept the world from unraveling. Every rope, every axe, every stake was part of the same vast machinery, a machinery powered by belief, by obedience, and by the quiet acceptance of cruelty as necessity. But behind every execution, there was always a question lingering in the air. Was justice that people watched that day? Or was it simply their own reflection, their fear, their fascination, their hunger for meaning in a world ruled by darkness? The sky is beginning to dim. The marketplace empties. The smell of smoke lingers. You walk away from the square, the image of the gallows still burning faintly behind your eyes. The streets grow quieter, the air colder. In the distance, you can hear the tolling of a church bell, slow, deliberate, unchanging. Each strike feels like a heartbeat fading into the night. And for a brief moment, you wonder, in an age so consumed by punishment,
The night has fallen over the city. You can almost feel it, the damp chill that seeps through stone walls, the faint shimmer of mist clinging to the cobblestones, the uneven rhythm of footsteps echoing through narrow medieval streets. It is long past curfew. The guards have made their rounds. The bells have struck 9, perhaps 10, though time in this era moves differently. It is measured not in hours, but in candles burned and prayers whispered. Inside the houses, people draw closer to the fire. The world beyond their doors is dark, unpredictable, dangerous. But within, even if the bread is stale and the smoke from the hearth stings the eyes, there is safety. Safety from thieves, safety from the cold, safety from the unknown. Because outside, the night belongs to others. The medieval night was the realm of those who could not or would not belong to the day.
There were thieves, yes, men who crept through alleys, skilled with knives and silent feet, their eyes quick and desperate. But there were also others, vagabonds, outcasts, widows accused of witchcraft, and those who had fled from punishment. Many of them were once ordinary people, reduced to shadows by hunger or exile. Some had committed crimes so small you would hardly call them crimes at all. Stealing a loaf, striking a god, questioning a priest. But in an age where poverty itself could be a sin, even survival became an act of defiance. You follow one such figure through the winding streets, a man wrapped in a cloak of coarse wool, his face hidden, his steps cautious. He moves past shuttered windows, past the faint glow of a tavern where laughter spills out like warm air, past the city walls where the torches burn low. This man, you sense, has seen much of the world. His posture is careful, his silence deliberate. When he finally stops, it is before a ruined chapel, long abandoned, its roof half collapsed, its stone walls blackened by soot. Inside, other shapes stir. Faces lean out from the shadows, gaunt, suspicious, tired. This is their refuge, the margins of society, a world that exists in parallel to the one of law and order. They share what they have: stale bread, rainwater caught in a clay jar, the faint warmth of a dying fire. Their voices are low, their words few. For them, every night is an act of endurance. In the daylight, they would be hunted, branded criminals, vagrants, heretics. But here, under the cloak of darkness, they are simply human. One woman cradles a sleeping child. Another man, toothless and thin, murmurs a story about how he once served a nobleman before being cast out. Someone hums a tune, an old, mournful song about home and loss. The melody echoes softly through the ruined chapel, weaving through the cracks in the stone. For a moment, even the darkness seems to listen. Not all crime in the medieval world was born of greed or cruelty. Some crimes were born of necessity. The thief who stole bread was not always wicked. Sometimes he was starving. The woman who cursed her neighbor might simply have been desperate for help. The soldier who deserted the battlefield might have done so because his family was dying at home. But the law, in its cold language, did not care for motives. A crime was a crime, and justice, or what passed for it, had to be seen. Yet the line between sin and survival was never clear. And so, in every shadowed corner, every narrow street, every tattered market stall, there lived those who had slipped through the cracks of the system, too poor to pay, too proud to kneel, too human to be perfect. As the centuries passed, cities grew, and the machinery of justice grew with them. Where once there had been gallows in the square, there were now prisons, grim, damp places filled with the smell of mold and despair. At first, prisons were not for punishment, but for holding the accused until judgment. But gradually, imprisonment itself became a sentence, a way to break the body without breaking the skin. In England, debtors' prisons became common by the 14th century. A man could be locked away not for murder or theft, but for owing more than he could pay. Inside, debtors lived among thieves and killers. They slept on straw, shared bowls of watery gruel, and waited, sometimes for years, for someone to pay their ransom. The irony was cruel. A man too poor to pay his debts could only be freed by money. And so the cycle continued. In the Ottoman Empire, punishments were often swift and symbolic. A thief might lose a hand, a liar might be whipped, but these acts were often carried out in public, designed not to torment the guilty, but to warn the living. The empire, vast and diverse, valued order above all. For sultans and viziers, justice was a mirror of power, a way to remind millions of subjects that even the mightiest were accountable to law, and that disobedience could not hide behind wealth or birth. Still, behind that order lay a quieter truth. The prisons of Istanbul, Cairo, and Damascus were filled not only with criminals, but with poets, scholars, and rebels, those whose words or beliefs threatened authority. Their punishments were rarely written in the records. Some disappeared into silence. And yet, centuries later, their names still whisper through the pages of history. You can picture it, the flicker of torchlight on the prison walls, the muffled sounds of men coughing in the dark, the faint dripping of water echoing in the distance. A guard walks by, his footsteps steady, his keys jangling softly at his side. The prisoners stir. Some whisper prayers. Others have long stopped speaking altogether. Somewhere a man carves words into the stone with a nail, not for others to read, but simply to prove he still exists. There is something deeply human in that act, a defiance that transcends centuries. Even in a world that crushed dissent, men and women found ways to remember themselves. As dawn begins to creep over the city once again, you imagine how it must have felt to live in such times, to walk a line so thin between guilt and innocence, survival and sin. The medieval world was not kind, but it was deeply human. Its darkness was not born only of cruelty, but of fear. Fear of chaos, of poverty, of losing control. And so societies built their laws, their gallows, their prisons, believing that by punishing others they could keep themselves safe. But in doing so, they left behind a trail of stories, stories of the condemned, the forgotten, and the misunderstood. Centuries later, we look back on those punishments with horror. The stocks, the racks, the flames, the heads on pikes, all relics of a world we tell ourselves we've outgrown. But yet, when you look closer, the same questions remain. What do we call justice? Who decides what is crime? And how many of those who suffered were simply caught in the wrong place, at the wrong time, under the wrong rule? The city is quiet again. The gallows are gone. The cobblestones glisten in the faint morning light. But somewhere under the surface of history, their echoes remain. The whispers of men and women who once walked this path, whose stories were written not in ink, but in blood and silence. You can almost hear them if you listen closely. A faint murmur of lives half-remembered, of choices misunderstood, of a time when to survive itself was a crime. And perhaps as you drift now into sleep, you begin to wonder, if you were born in that world, in that century, under those laws, would you have been among the righteous or among the condemned?